Hello, welcome to LinkedIn Live. I'm Jim Vinoski. I'm your host for this episode of CE Growth Talks with Chief Outsiders. And I am the host of the Manufacturing Talks web show and podcast and a manufacturing contributor at Forbes. And I'm really glad to be joined today by Bob Sherlock and Tim Van Mieghem. Welcome, guys.
Jim, nice to be here.
Thank you.
Good to see you. Good to see you. So I'm going to let you guys introduce yourselves. Bob, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Bob Sherlock with Chief Outsiders. We are a company that provides fractional growth officers to mostly mid-size and fast-growing companies. Help them with everything from marketing strategy to driving execution in the marketplace to grow their sales profitably.
Wonderful. Yeah, again, welcome. And then Tim, how about you?
Good. Thank you very much. Yeah, Tim Van Mieghem, a partner with the ProAction group here out of Chicago, and we work with middle market companies and private equity firms that acquire middle market companies, and really in a couple of areas. We're related to operations, and when we'll help bring clarity, especially pre-close. If a private equity firm's looking at a deal, they might bring in an accountant to do a Q of E or quality of earnings report to understand what earnings are. They would bring us in to understand one, what should earnings be? What could they be? Yep. And two, from the operations standpoint, are there any negative surprises that they'd want to know about before they write the check? And post-close or for a private owner, we do quite a bit of work to help transform and the company, increase velocity, address all the crazy supply chain issues, and help to serve customers and fill demand well.
All useful stuff. I guess boredom is not a problem for you then.
No.
Well, good. And we're here to talk about something that will also not be boring because it's all about investment. And the topic is the dollars you can invite to stay a while in your company, which I just find to be an intriguing heading. And so I definitely want to drill into the thoughts behind it. And, it's a rich topic because I think, anytime you're in tough economic times, people are maybe a little bit hesitant and a little bit scratching their heads around investment. So that's what I wanted to kick off with is your thoughts on, I think maybe it's a knee jerk during, leading into recession or having tough times with cost or labor, which we're all experiencing right now, to pull back on investment. So why might that not be the greatest idea? We'll start with you, Tim.
So thank you. Thank you, Jim. So from my perspective, one, I'd like to maybe recast the word investment too, or open that up a little bit, because it certainly does relate to capital expenditures and investing in new equipment or automation or facility or whatever it might be. But I would even say more relevant, more timely, more actionable are the changes and improvements that we can make to make better use of what we have, and to, let me put it, we often find, go in and look and work with a company, there's often ways to increase the velocity of their process, of what they do. So if it's manufacturing company, if we can we ship 15 or 20% more with the same labor and same overhead we already have? The answer to that question is often yes. And sometimes it's not 20%. I've seen it literally as high as 70. And there are other times where we say, you know what, you're running this, it's spinning like a top. Maybe we can get 3 or 4 or 5% more. But it's a great time to look. And one of the things that I love about working with private equity is this concept. Success can often hide opportunity. Mm-hmm. When a company is growing, profitable, and their customers aren't complaining, why look at operations? Why look and see if we can be better? Because all of our feedback is positive.
Yeah.
With private equity, when they buy a company, it's an artificial time to go in and look, and kick the tires, and understand what do we do? Well, how are we running the company today and why? And as we do that, we often find these opportunities to increase velocity, reduce the cost to purchase goods, reduce lead times. There's many different potential things we can impact. And that is also, I don't want to be glib, but it's one of the gifts of a hard time like this. When we have all this volatility in the supply chain, we have tight labor markets, is that it gives us an excuse or a reason to dig in and look at what we're doing and ask the question, and look for that opportunity to do more with what we have, which isn't, it's not about asking people to work harder. I'll say this, the preponderance of things that we help our clients do is to figure out what things they do that don't add value to the customers and then stop doing those things.
Yep.
And, right. I mean, I don't mean to oversimplify it. It's a big part of the equation.
Right. And yeah, you risk that oversimplification talking in broad terms, but you're singing my tune in a couple of ways. Number one, you mentioned manufacturing specifically, and that really is a golden opportunity in my world, is when things slow down to get after those improvement opportunities you don't otherwise do. And then you hear the horror stories all the time of people going into like lean and Six Sigma efforts and failing because they just don't have the time to invest in it. Well, when things have slowed down, what a golden opportunity that is, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Excellent. Over to you, Bob. How about your thoughts on investing in tough times?
Well, it's because of the tendency to underestimate how much improvement is possible, either in terms of the resources, the people resources, the working capital, and other assets of the company. People tend to assume that they are operating closer to optimal than they really are, that there's a much higher degree of improvement available operationally. And the same thing is true in terms of marketplace potential. There's a tendency to think, hey, we've been working so hard to try and come by growth and get these increments of growth. It's easy to assume that, hey, we're right out on the frontier. But in fact, with some simple but profound changes, it's possible to grow a whole lot faster. So coming back to investment, the whole idea about, invite these dollars that are coming in the door to stay longer is to say you actually can, to the extent that you need to make additional investments in growing your business, some of those dollars can be found through the greater efficiencies, the tremendous improvements in efficiencies that exist within the company that, Tim kind of alluded to.
Right. Yeah. And you just dove into the meat of our topic. And so I definitely want to drill a little more into that. When you talk about dollars coming in and keeping them in your company longer, where do you see the big opportunities, the areas that people might see that happening, but maybe miss the reality of there are resources there that they can tap into? Going back to you, Bob.
Tim, do you want to lead on that one?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. Thank you very much. So the first area I want to tie back to something we just talked about a few minutes ago, and that is, and you brought it up with lean quality systems and so forth, because people ask me oftentimes, many manufacturing companies, labor is a small percentage of their cost of goods sold or of sales. It's like, gosh, even if you hit a home run and you cut labor costs in half, you've just moved it a couple points. Like, why bother focusing on that? And the point is not labor costs. It is not labor costs at all. The real issue, it's not irrelevant, but it's not the point. The point is velocity. And think about this. Oftentimes when we go in and look at a company before a private equity firm buys it, we'll often find we can increase the velocity of this company by 20%. We can get 20% out more through, either line speed, uptime, quality improvements, whatever it might be, or improving the flow. There's something there that we say, okay, let's just use 20% as an example. And let's say too, we can either impact reduce scrap rates, or maybe we can negotiate with our suppliers to reduce the cost of purchased goods by a percentage, like 1 point. And if we can combine that with growing 10 or 15%, when that's an option, here's what we find. This is the math. is it will often increase earnings by 30 to 100%. And think about this for a second. Those are three C's, right? Velocity by 20% by really focusing on your process from order to shipment is within reach for 80% of the companies out there, I will say, especially in the middle market. To reducing scrap or the cost to purchase goods by a percentage, really focus that's possible. And today, despite the crazy, economy, many companies are still growing, and 10 or 15% growth is another single. Three singles can literally double the profitability of a company. And a lot of that is because it's not just the cost of labor, it's overhead absorption. It's if we're selling 20% more, we don't add labor, we don't add equipment or a new CEO or a new facility or whatever. The only marginal cost is the cost of materials. That is a within reach. I don't even want to say what percentage of companies, but it's not rare. It's not uncommon. Okay, this is a reason to focus on it. And that's an area where we can keep more of our dollars, especially like you're right, Jim. When things are tough and you have some capacity to focus, that's a great time to implement change. Here's the other side of that is if you're growing 10 or 20%, you almost, the ROI on finding that velocity and opportunity internally is a factor. Because of the impact of being able to do overhead absorption, additional margin dollars, and all that good stuff. It's very, very powerful.
Yeah. That's good stuff. And I think that's the challenge, is for people to take that step back and realize what those opportunities represent. So Bob, what about you? What are your thoughts on that one?
So I think, a corollary or maybe an add-on to the idea about, keeping the dollars inside longer, related ideas, getting the dollars in a little bit sooner. Tim and I have talked about this, and Jim, you and I have chatted too. There's so many companies now that, because of supply chain issues, it's almost a joke, right? It's, it's so ubiquitous. People that never, 2 or 3 years ago knew anything about business. I mean, I've had 13-year-old kids say like, well, yeah, we couldn't get that because of supply chain. It's a different world, but realistically, there are some things that can be done from linking operations more tightly to the pace of demand that's coming in. There's so many improvements that are possible that instead of having on-time delivery rates go down or fill rates go down or something, it's possible to use disciplines like sales and operations planning to more closely link plant operations to demand. And when we do that, instead of having backlogs grow, instead of having, oh, gee, we missed the month because we couldn't get enough materials to build and ship on time, it's possible to actually address all of those things so that the money comes in sooner, which in effect is another sort of way of funding working capital without having to go to the bank and borrow.
Right. Yeah. As you were talking about that, I was thinking about the kind of excellent companion piece to what we're discussing here today that you posted, Bob, your blog, The Dollars You Could Invite to Stay. It's at the Chief Outsiders website. I recommend everyone check it out. You touched on a couple of key points that in the article that tie to what you just said, and those are longer supply chain lead times and volatility and shrinking of the labor force. And, my mind immediately goes to COVID, and you kind of referred to that with kids now talking about supply chain. I can't get that candy bar because of the supply chain. So yeah, we've all had a lot of lessons through the last few years. What are the key takeaways from what we learned in the COVID times that tie to keeping your dollars around and using that to your advantage? So let's go to you first on this one, Bob.
So I think Um, there's those of us that work more in marketing and sales, we tend to be focused on how do we generate greater demand, or how do we stimulate demand, and all that. And all that's really, really important. But we have to also, as marketers, sales, growth officers, et cetera, we've also got to be thinking about our ability to fulfill. And there's an operational aspect to the job description in marketing and sales that it ties again to the idea of the more closely that we can link supply with expected levels of demand, and the better we get at either being able to forecast or make adjustments as we either see the level of demand or the mix of demand change. We actually are in a position then to affect how the operational side of the company is positioned to fulfill those things. So, the philosophy of lean, of course, is that the more that plant operations can be tied to the patterns of customer demand, as opposed to the old days of, oh, let's build inventory. Oh, gee, we got too much, and let's sort of draw the inventories down, et cetera. To the extent that we can get those things linked, tremendous things happen, including, our ability to service the customers at a very, very high level. And, whether it's a consumer products manufacturer that's selling through retail, I mean, that's a business to business relationship where the retailer for the consumer products manufacturer, that's a customer that wants to be able to count on having the right stuff available so that, something is pulling right off the shelf because of demand stimulation programs, that the fulfillment is going to be, right in step with that. And then, I work much more often with manufacturers that are not providing finished goods, but instead an intermediate good. Maybe they supply materials or manufactured components, or maybe they supply capital equipment and so on. The same principle applies. If we can devote some attention from the demand side, from the customer-facing side of the business and marketing and sales, to gathering the best information we can, and it's not going to be accurate, but if it's directionally correct, and then we're feeding that as an input into a well-integrated sales and operations planning process, then we enable our brethren in the operations to just get those operational efficiencies, et cetera, that keep more of the dollars in, so that we can self-fund and not have to go to external capital as much to fund the growth and support the growth.
Right. Yep. How about you, Tim? What were your big takeaways from the pandemic years?
Yeah. There's a couple, and one thing that you made me think of, Bob, is also thinking about sort of the trajectory of a growing company. Early in a company's stage or phase, the founder, has created something from nothing, right? And their sheer willpower, their brilliance, their idea, their desire to make it work, their personal engagement in almost every aspect of the company is critical. And so a company at that stage, you come into a pandemic where your variables have suddenly changed. My lead times have gone from 2 to 3 days to 3 to 4 months, or as an example, the cost of goods sold has dramatically changed, the cost of purchased goods, and the volatility is there. And like you said, it's harder to hire people. When someone with strategic intent, when the CEO, the founder is involved, they're going to make those decisions, and they're going to say, okay, you know what? Here's the inventory I have to have. How am I going to handle this? Am I going to buy ahead? Am I going to talk to my customers and say, hey, if you want this material, if you want my product in 6 months, we've got to order the raw materials now, right? They're going to, you're not going to be surprised that at that level and that type of company, the CEO is going to make good decisions and sort of navigate these complex waters. Then as you get to a more, mature phase where the CEO is going from being like the chief performer involved in all the critical areas of the company to now a developer of teams and leaders, you're going to rely on systems. You're going to rely on norms and standards, and the people involved are going to be focused in their area. And one of the things that I think this will make a lot of sense is when your systems, we have to update the variables. So one thing I heard a lot of is during COVID that just-in-time inventory doesn't work anymore. MRP doesn't work anymore, right? And in a sense, it works. It always works. And the key is that our variables, our lead times have changed. Our safety stock and standard deviation of how reliable our suppliers have changed. And that leads us to needing to revisit where we go. I've seen and worked with some companies that were not highly process oriented. They had a lot of inventory at the beginning of COVID, and they looked brilliant at that time, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then there's other companies that looked like they were caught off guard. They were tight on inventory. They were lean. But what ends up happening, you go out a year, and the companies that were operating just in time, and Bob brought up sales and operations planning. If you think of lean as getting all the departments in the factory, all the operations to work at the pace of demand from the customer, SOP is like, how do we get every other department to work at that same pace?
Right.
Yeah. Right. And so one of the things you do with an effective S&OP process is when you run into a new season, whether it's every year or it's cyclical or it's a pandemic that has changed the supply chain, you reset all of your variables. This is my new standard deviation. This is my new lead time for each of my products. And it leads to different decisions. And this is where we come back in then to the chief outsiders world. We will not make money if we absorb all the new pricing that's in place with our suppliers and raw materials. And we can plan that out and hopefully get ahead of the game in terms of how do we handle this.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yep. I really love that point about just in time. And it's interesting. I at times was one of those saying, so this shows just in time isn't quite what it's cracked up to be. But you're exactly right. Just in time works, period. But it works different when the supply chain's running smoothly versus when the supply chains have jumbled up mess, right?
Gotten stretched out.
Yep. So you touched on a couple of things, both of you, I wanted to dig into a little more. And one of those is, as you were talking, I'm sitting here thinking, and I think one of you said earlier that there's disparate impacts of both COVID and just the difficulties in general in the economy these days. There are winners and losers, right? Mm-hmm. And so if I'm one of these companies that took it on the chin, and we're talking about, there's dollars to be had out there. And I'm thinking, and I'm spending them all on the labor costs that seem to be going up weekly, and I'm having to run additional inventory just to cover my tail because my suppliers aren't delivering like they used to. Where do those people find the dollars? How do you talk to them about, but you still need to be identifying these assets and opportunities and tying them together?
Well, one thing that, and I know Tim is hearing this too, and Jim, I'm sure you are. Just about everybody is dealing with a scarcer labor market. It's harder to, recruit new people, and it is, it's getting tougher to retain people, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that's helpful in terms of, retaining the dollars is it's possible there's so much frustration that can build up inside the employees in an organization, whether they are working on, they're in customer service roles and interfacing with customers that maybe there's more issues, et cetera. There's frustrations that can build there, or in the plant, or in, materials receiving, et cetera. And so there's an opportunity to actually improve the environment of working in the company by tackling some of these processes. And that just the way we've always done it isn't good enough. And Jim, you've been in so many plants that have a mindset of continuous improvement instead, that say, look, it might be a bunch of little things, but over a period of time, these little things tend to have a really big impact. And so even if a company is saying like, hey, we're really kind of, feeling up against it, et cetera, there are things that they can be doing. And to Tim's point earlier, this is not a lot of cash outlay stuff, or it's very modest cash outlay, if any. There are things they can be doing to tap the knowledge of the people in the company that know the processes the best, and they can get somebody to impartial to facilitate and say, what are the things that we're doing to ourselves every day that are gumming up the works, that are creating points of frustration between, say, your department and another department, et cetera. And then, so it may be a process without diving into details too much. There could be a list of stuff, and then take a look at it and say, hey, there might be a handful of things that over the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month, et cetera, that we could do, that we could make some changes. It would take some frustration out of the process. And so I think that, within a relatively short time, they can certainly take down their retention risk, and the worries about having to recruit more people, et cetera. And it doesn't take very long. And Tim will know this too. You start to really see the metrics improving, whether it's service levels to the customer, whether it's, the hours that it takes to process an order or to fulfill an order and so on. All those things start to get better, which then are going to flow through to the income statement in particular, and, eventually the balance sheet as well, from all of those little improvements that really add up.
Yeah, I love that. The tendency, I think, in good times is that you get away from your frontline people. So that's another opportunity, obviously, is if things are tough, get back in with them, tie in with them, and get those thoughts for the small improvements.
Yeah,
Tim, what do you have to add?
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Bob.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I'm at a client location in North Carolina now, and I'm doing a set of interviews. And, to me, the 80% of what we need to do to, create better growth or to make improvements and so on, the folks in the operation already know. And so somebody coming in from the outside, like Tim and his team, or, my colleagues and I, is part of what we do is to discover internally, what do the people in the company collectively know that's actually going to make a big difference in their growth or in their operational efficiency. Now, we'll always go out and gather voice of the customer and voice of the non-customer, et cetera, because we're going to find some ahas out there. They're going to help us, build demand and then also a better customer experience, et cetera, et cetera. But gosh, there's so much expertise, and a lot of times, when we finally have compiled stuff and report back out, sitting in the audience, probably 3/4 of the people are saying under their breath, I've been telling management that for years, and they never listened.
Yeah, been there, done that.
Yeah.
So, Tim, what do you have to add on this one? I know you touched on it earlier, but expound on how you get after it if you're one taking it in the chin.
I want to expand on something you both just talked about, which is the knowledge of the people in the company. And one of the most, and now I'm going to talk about the inside part, the parts that we control, not necessarily the voice of the customer, but pulling your people together and doing, I would call it like a value stream map, but essentially, let's start with, how do we find out that we are going to sell something to a customer wants something? Let's walk through the process. Every single person who touches it, every department that touches it, what's the process? And every time this happens, every time, especially when you do it with a group of people at one time, they'll say, I didn't know you did that. Why are we doing that? And boy, if you could do it this way, it would really change what I do. And what often happens, I think of this one quote from Einstein, who said, if I had an hour to save the world from an impending danger, I would take 55 minutes to study the problem and 5 minutes to solve it. And that opportunity to walk through and, like you said, to go get closer to the people on the floor, the different departments in your company, and understand what they're doing today and why, often will lead to good clarity on what we're doing today. And that becomes a launch pad for what can we do different that would make it have a different outcome or speed it up. It's a, Jim had mentioned that there's, we want to it's great to make many small improvements. What this mapping process allows you to do is start with the end in mind. You map the process and then you reverse engineer the improvements you're going to do to achieve a future state, right? And it allows us to kind of avoid random acts of improvement and do things that are really going to affect the things that matter to our customers, which I think in turn means velocity. The more, we can hit the timing. It also can affect flexibility. So the more we reduce lead time, the more to make or create our products, the more options we have to be flexible and how we win and where we start. And it allows us to not only have enough product to fill demand, but also more on the terms that the customer would like it.
Well, that's perfect. And Tim, I'm thinking too that variety or mix, for manufacturers, wholesalers, et cetera, as they're dealing with some shifts in what people are demanding, variety, I think, is operationally a little bit trickier to handle. But if the time that it takes to adapt to a change and maybe change over a machine or something, if that time gets reduced, then the company is in a better position to react to those changes in demand, right?
Absolutely. And I would tie it into two ideas here, because you're right. Like, there's a significant benefit, and I think one trend that we've seen over the past decade, and it's continuing, is the trend to people ordering only what they need when they need it. We're getting to smaller runs. We're getting to more frequent changeovers. So clearly, in so many ways, getting good at doing changeovers is dramatically effective. The second thing I would say about this is something that's dramatic that often happens. We go in and look at a company, and we often will ask, are you a long run, low mix company, or high mix, low volume, right? And we'll always get the answer. But here's the reality. Every company is both. You have high run items that you make, and you have many small run items as well. And one of the issues that is a great place to look is when you're using the same process to manage both. It doesn't work. How you run a high mix, low volume, and how you run a high volume, low mix operation is very different. And you can do the same under the same roof, do them both under the same roof, but manage them differently, have different processes, recognize it, have clarity about that.
Yeah.
Well, I'm back, guys. What I like to do, I probably should have told you this up front, is if I feel like I'm personally boring the audience, I sign myself off, I'll chug a couple Mountain Dews, and come on back. I'm all revved up. It sounds like you guys kept the conversation going through my little link.
We'll some people keeping the conversation is a complimentary way to put it. We appreciate. Some other people might be like, they're just blabbering on.
Well, it did give me a chance to revisit everything I wanted to touch on, so I didn't miss anything. And one that's been near and dear to my heart, I've actually had some people on my web show about this, that you mentioned in the article, Bob, in your blog, is ERP. And to me, that's one that is so polarizing because so many people, including me, from our past, have this tendency to kind of cringe when you hear the term enterprise resource planning. But done well, it goes right to the point of everything we've been talking about, doesn't it?
Right.
So let you start since it was your point in the blog, Bob.
Yeah, glad to do it. And like Tim's firm, our firm, Chief Outsiders, some of the companies that we deal with, have private investment backing, private equity firms backing them, and some are, still family-run companies, et cetera, et cetera. And they range in size. And the first thing that I would mention, some people have talked about it, if somebody's in the, $10 million, $20 million range or something like that, they might look at any kind of resource planning, material planning, enterprise planning, sales and operations planning, and say, well, that's really for big companies. But no, there's a simple enough version, for your company. And so I would say, number one, be aware of that. And again, the philosophy is going to be that you want a process by which all of the functions in your business are communicating on the vital topics about demand and fulfillment and the inputs to those things. And there are different technology solutions, different enterprise systems from an IT standpoint, of course, depending on the scale of the enterprise. But, the point is, don't get too lost in that, but really focus on the process. And, firms like ours can be brought in to help and facilitate. We've guided people through different things before. But even if somebody is saying like, okay, not the right time, or, I don't feel ready to bring in an outside resource, if they just really think about, inputs and outputs, who are the providers of information and the consumers of information, and how do you support each other internally? If they go through some discussion about that as a team, that is an excellent place to begin. And then they can add more sophisticated efforts as they go.
Yeah. Excellent. How about you, Tim?
Yeah, so a couple of thoughts here that one will build on something we talked about earlier, which is updating the variables of lead times and volatility in the market in our system. And almost every time when we are talking to a client and the system itself is brought up as an issue, or they're questioning whether they need a new system, or if there are issues with order fulfillment or growing inventory, or we go to run a line and we don't have the right materials. Okay, the issue is almost never the ERP system itself. The issue is almost always that either our bills of material, our perpetual inventory, our routings are not accurate. That's the place to start.
Yep.
Is, and here's my point. I make this into a tongue twister in my attempt to be funny. Sometimes talking to people, and I'll say, look, if you want to buy a new system, essentially what's going to happen is you're going to spend a lot more money to not use your ERP system. You're not using your current one, right? Yeah. And the enormous potential to actually leverage whatever system you have by going back to the basics and making sure that if the system says we have this much of that part in that location, that it's true. That if your people are not relying on your system, then what's going to happen. What's going to happen is the buyers, they get beat up terribly if they run a line out. If someone goes to run a product and they can't because we're out, they're going to hear about it. Yeah. And they're going to say, I don't ever want that to happen again.
Right.
How often does a CFO go to a buyer and say, hey, you've got too much inventory, what's going on? It doesn't happen. Well, I'm sure it happens at times, but it's not that same. So people are going to I'm going to buy more. I'm going to buy more. I'm going to make sure I never run out because I don't know exactly what I have. but I want to make sure I don't run out. And that leads to, we've now got a full warehouse, but we still can't fill orders because we've got too much of some things and not enough of others. And the only way to do that when you've got 1,000 SKUs that are made up of, 10 times that many raw materials and components is to know what you have, period. And that requires accurate inventory transactions and timely, accurate, perpetual, accurate bills, and updating the metrics and the variables. Like that before you ever think about putting in a new system.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I want to provide a little defense of some of the people who might have a system and maybe aren't using it or aren't using it completely. If it's a really old one, it's probably not really intuitive and not with a lot of features to direct people through it. Whereas today is, they almost walk you through every single thing you can do.
Yeah.
But to your point, if you're not using it and you don't have the discipline to hold people accountable for making use of those tools you provide, you're not going to succeed with a new one either. Because people are always going to default to what they know and what they're comfortable with.
We've all heard the horror stories of ERP systems, new ones taking the company to their knees.
Yeah.
But it really is amazing.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry, Tim.
I was just going to say, this is an option for things under your control to prevent that from happening, and I think you're right. Like, even if let's say you're using an old system and you're not using it, right? We don't have accurate inventory systems and all that. Go ahead and do the research and start to find the right system, but require that we're going to start using the system today. We're going to do cycle count. We're going to do transactions on time. We're going to get the bombs correct. So otherwise the new system will kill you.
Yeah, I think that is exactly right. Making people understand that we're not going to maintain the old way. We're not going to fall back to that even as we move forward. I was going to say, though, it is amazing the specialty options that are out there now, ERPs that are specifically for my world of manufacturing, for example, and then add-ons that are specific to individual kinds of businesses too. So you're definitely not tied into the giant monstrosities of 15, 20 years ago anymore. So there are better options out there.
Amen.
So we're getting down to the last points that I wanted to touch with you guys. We definitely want to leave time for some questions, and just wanted to let people know you can toss out questions on the chat anytime.
Right.
We'll get those posted and we'll come back to them. But to throw out one final question for you guys on the meat of the topic, again, referring to your blog, Bob, you mentioned specifically decreasing and slowing dollars going out the door.
Right.
I think we've touched on it, but we haven't hit that point as specifically as I'd like to. So can you tell me more about your thoughts around that?
So dollars going out the door would certainly include payroll. Do we, for the current level of demand, are we spending more on people than we need to be? And it's not like, oh, gee, let's lay off a bunch of people, because in many cases, like, no, if we operate more efficiently, to Tim's point about velocity and throughput, with the people that we have, we actually can be doing a much better job. And if we've got internal bottlenecks, we eliminate those bottlenecks, we may be able to shift some people from where they're not going to be needed because the numbers are a factor of a bottleneck there, and we can free them up and train them for new positions, et cetera. So labor dollars going out the door is one. Another form of dollars going out the door is having more inventory, like raw material. We buy more raw materials than we need in a point in time. So, we got the revenue dollars in the door from our customers, but then some of those are going out to the suppliers at a faster rate than they would be if we had a well-balanced system. So those are two examples of what I mean by the dollars that go out the door that we could invite to stay or stay a little longer. Because if we can do that, then again, if we've got a bank line of credit or something like that, we don't need to tap that quite as hard. because we just won't burn through as much cash as quickly.
Good. How about you, Tim?
Yeah, so there's maybe three topics here I'd like to cover. I think Bob covered, and we've talked about the labor side and velocity, which is a great place to start and to look. The second one, which I'll touch on just briefly because it's simple, is looking at your cost to purchase goods and services. The opportunity to negotiate with your suppliers and to think about at what level you negotiate is a powerful option. And here's an example. We've seen this a lot. It continues to be a big issue, is companies will negotiate, like especially companies that do projects or they do specific new product releases. They'll negotiate with suppliers for each new product release, new product family, or if it's a project-based company, they'll do it by project or customer order, as opposed to negotiating for the entire amount that you buy over a year and for a multiple year process. Not saying you give somebody all your business, and I know there's a lot of details to work out, but this is the way I put it with a client recently. You're negotiating with your supplier $50,000 at a time or $100,000 at a time. Your collective business, though, for the year is closer to 15 million. And if we negotiated a 4-year contract, that's the type of contract that private planes whisk CEOs around to negotiate. Okay, if you want to get beyond the PO and sales reps policy limitations on what you're going to do with that supplier, that's one way to go, and it's woefully underutilized as an approach. A lot of companies, I think, have a good opportunity there. And the next one ties into something Bob said about, on the working capital side, and it is to stop and study your SKUs and your customers. And we'll often do we call it, it's a 9-box analysis, but it's essentially a segmentation tool where you look at large volume SKUs that are sold to large customers, large volume SKUs sold to small customers, and small SKUs sold to large and small customers. And you look at each of those segments, look at the number of SKUs, look at the gross margin dollars that you earn, and take it all the way down to the operating margin level. Like, what's the real profitability of each part of our business? And here's the other this is the other huge aha that comes out of this that often happens. So what ends up happening frequently is that large SKU, large customer block can be 80 to 120% of the profits of a company. And you might ask, how can it be over 100%? That doesn't make any sense. Well, that's because in other parts of the company, they're actually giving money, they're giving it back to the customers. They're losing money when you look at the cost to process orders, deliver them, manage everything that's going in. And I'm not suggesting that you just go stop selling these SKUs, but when you realize where we're making money and where we're giving it back, you can make a couple of decisions. The first one that is mind-blowing for me, that was mind-blowing for me the first time I recognized this, you often find that 85% of your gross margin dollars come from 10% of our SKUs. Okay, so guess what we're going to do? All of our planning, all of our best minds are going to be focused on how we fill those orders for those SKUs. Mm-hmm. And we're going to manage the inventory. So that's where we can we just had a client where that bucket, they had over 40 days of inventory. On finished goods, they had 6 months inventory of raw materials, and their conversion time was a day or two. Okay, we theoretically we can manage this with a week's worth of inventory based on their capacity and their having the raw materials that are there. That frees up. Oftentimes, that's 20-30% of their total finished goods inventory that we can start managing, because that's where the money is, and we can get good at it. And everything else, we're gonna manage. We're gonna put in min and max levels. We're gonna spend almost no time managing them after we do that. Because it's 15% of your dollars. Who cares? I'm sorry, that was cavalier. We do care, but I don't want to spend time. I want to run my plant to fill the 85% of our dollars and run the rest of the plant in a way that doesn't impact that first piece.
Yeah. Good. We're at 10 minutes, and congratulations, Tim, because you actually anticipated our first question. There might be some nuances here that you want to revisit before I move back to Bob. And the question was thoughts on optimizing SKU count as you balance marketing progress and operational efficiency, and then with a focus specifically on direct-to-consumer e-commerce.
So I want to say two things, and thank you for letting me extend. The first one is operations is here to fill demand. Okay. The idea, like, I don't want to get into this mindset where, hey, we could be way more profitable if we just stop selling these items or we don't offer this service, whatever. No, it's the other way around. Marketing, the strategy says, here's what we need to be good at and deliver to our customers. The duty of operations is to find a good way to fill that demand. Okay. So that's the first piece. The second piece, though, right after that, is to understand our profitability in serving different customers and selling different SKUs. And when there's areas where we're highly profitable and other areas where we're not profitable, that's where it's not a black or white issue. It's not either we sell it or we don't sell it. Do we have a different lead time? Do we charge for freight? Or have different policies for these customers on these SKUs. Some things you might change from make to stock to make to order. Okay, there's 30 different ways to not impact the fact that we can offer a complete basket of services and goods to our customers, but also not have it become an albatross around our neck where we can't manage this and stay profitable.
Yeah, and if I can build, I mean, a future post of mine is, whereas today was the dollars that are coming in the door that we can invite to stay longer. Topic number 2 for the future is going to be dollars that could be and should be coming in the door that aren't because of pricing or terms and conditions and things like that. And so it could be that, if there are SKUs that are going to be inherently slower moving. So, if we're thinking about direct to consumer e-commerce and clothing or shoe sizes or something like that, is like there are color elements and there are also some size elements that, if you happen to be, an unusual shoe size or a less common shoe size or dress size or whatever it might be, I'm seeing some direct to consumer and other e-commerce brands say, okay, if you're one of those unusual sizes, we are gonna offer it to you, but it's going to be $2 more, $10 more, or whatever the thing might be for that particular kind of dress. And then the consumer can say, hey, that's worth the extra $10 to me, or it's not. And so rather than having to strictly say we're going to offer it or not offer it, we could offer it on a different basis, which I think is another flavor of the point Tim was making.
Right. Yep. Excellent. I did want to go back into your previous answer before the SKU one, Tim, and commend you on that cost focus, because we talked about focusing on improving operations. And I think equally valid is when times are good, the spending tends to go into autopilot, right?
Right.
And so when things slow down, taking a look at every line item and what the money's going out for, to me, in my experience, has paid huge dividends. I walked into a plant one time and we had these 5-gallon water bubblers everywhere. And after I'd been there a while, tasting the tap water, it was fine. I asked people why we had this bottled water and nobody knew. It was $20,000 a year. We're spending on bottled water. That line item went away.
Yeah, that's right.
And so to remind everyone, throw your questions out there. We have about 6 more minutes. In the meantime, Bob did refer to a coming session to follow up on this one, so watch for that. And I'm really looking forward to it. As we get close to wrapping up, is there anything we haven't touched on that is kind of burning in your guys' minds that you want to mention before we wrap up?
So I have a quick one that really builds on your last point, Jim. And that is one of the things that's almost like can be funny or talked about in a jokey way is when you go and talk to an operator on the floor and look at what they actually do. And then when you talk to someone in leadership or the executive team and you ask them what those people are doing, it's amazing how little those two have in common.
Yep.
And when you have the opportunity or create the opportunity for an executive to go to where the work is done and to walk through that process and understand, it's to listen, not to judge, be curious, but understand what they're doing and why, that is going to open up dozens or hundreds of ideas that will be, it's a rich thing. Because think about this. Those are the things that people do 100 times every day. You improve it a little bit, it makes a big difference overall.
Great point. Yep. How about you, Bob? Anything burning you want to toss out there?
I guess a point. One of the things that, it's common for my colleagues and I to see companies doing random acts of marketing or random acts of sales, et cetera. What's reassuring is many of the companies really do glue everything together, and that marketing is not just about doing campaigns or something to try and generate leads, and sales is not just trying to grab orders and throw them over the transom. And there is communication. Everybody understands that, we stand for something to our customers, and we're all going to succeed or fail together and sort of hang in. But there are times I go out and I see companies that are operating kind of siloed. Sales is doing their thing, marketing's doing, and so on. You've seen it too. And so I would just encourage somebody, as you think about operating in a more challenging time, which clearly we're in, just make sure, test yourself. Are we one of the companies where everybody is talking together and everybody's on the same page, or have we in some aspects or some respects gotten a little bit siloed? And if that's the case, then correct that, because if the entire thing gets together, and to Tim's point, the brand promise to the customer that marketing is in charge of leading and figuring out which markets and which customers are the highest priority, all of that stuff that's kind of within marketing. Being able to have the whole organization understanding that promise and then gearing operations to do it. Do all of that, and you'll be in a much better position to grow the company, grow profitability, and keep more of the dollars, invite them to stay a little bit longer, and those dollars will and help you either drop something more to the bottom line or to fund additional growth programs out in the market.
Yep. Once again, I'm going to tip my hat to you, Tim, on your previous point, and I think expand on it. Definitely get your executives out with your frontline workers. But even if you're one of the supervisors of those frontline workers and you haven't spent a couple hours with an operator, go do that. If you're a plant manager, get out there for half a day and spend it with the people who are getting the job done, and you will learn something. And you're right, you'll turn up improvement opportunities you never would have expected without being out there. So excellent point. And we are almost out of time. Oh, we have one more question just popped up. Thoughts on the impact on current supply chain developments on budgets for 2023? Bob, real quick, you got about 30 seconds.
I would say as quickly as possible, get the demand supply, operational conversations going, and just communicate what we think is going to be happening and the corrective actions we could take to offset any negative impacts.
Excellent. Over to you, Tim.
Yeah, I'm going to just emphasize the part that, it is what it is on the supply chain and what we're going to have to pay in a lot of cases. We're having to pay at higher prices. But on the key, one thing that is really back on the marketing side is to make sure that your pricing is in line with what you're finding, that we're making a strategic choice on that and giving our customers the choice before we commit the money on whether they want to pay that or not.
Yeah.
Excellent way to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Tim Van Mieghem from the ProAction Group and Bob Sherlock from Chief Outsiders. Thank you. Excellent discussion.
Jim, thanks. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, it was fantastic. Thank you, Jim.
Great
We'll
to
do
be
this
together.
again soon. I'm Jim Vinoski with Manufacturing Talks, and thank you everyone for joining us.